The year was 1985, and children all over the United States were picking up their controllers, pressing the start button, and hearing the following music for the first time. Over the next few hours, they would guide their little mustache plumber who wore red and blue tights through multiple levels, through a castle. He would fight mushrooms and turtles, and he would just miss the princess time after time. And many times they would almost throw the controller in frustration thinking they got her, but they didn't. What these kids didn't realize was the phenomenon had just begun, and what they never could have realized was just how big that phenomenon would become. My name is Anthony Scala, and welcome to my informative speech on the history of video games. In this speech, I'm going to tell you about the origins, the first game, the first system. I'm going to tell you about the growing popularity of video games, the first popular system, the dozens that have come out since then, and I'm going to tell you about some statistics relating to those, the revenue they create, who plays games, and the most popular games and systems of all time. Now, when it comes to the origins of video games, they actually began much longer ago than you would think. According to Joe Gettler of the Brookhaven National Laboratory, the first game was created in 1958 by a fellow scientist at the Brookhaven National Laboratory. It was called Tennis for Two, and it was created by William Higginbotham. He was a nuclear scientist who had also worked on the Manhattan Project. What he did, he created a video game for annual visitors. It was called Tennis for Two again, and he just did it. It was for an annual Visitors Day attraction. It was a fun way to pass the time. It wasn't supposed to be anything more serious than that. All it was a little ball that bounced back and forth on the screen that people control with a little paddle. And it was viewed on a screen. It turned out to be very popular. In fact, it was so popular that hundreds of people lined up in order to play it. Now, most people know Pong as the first video game. Although it wasn't, it was the most well-known first video game. Created in 1972 by Nolan Bushnell, he made one single unit, and he put it in a tavern in California. 2 weeks later, he got a phone call because it wasn't working anymore. He went in to check it out, and what happened was the coin box was overflowing because of the popularity of this unit. Now, he wanted to make more, but no one would do it. The reason they gave was because they felt that hoodlums would come in and steal the television sets out of the units, and then that would negate the cost of what it cost to make these units, and it wouldn't be profitable for them. So, instead, he decided, rather than get someone else's help, he would do it himself. He created his company, called it Atari, and he produced the units on his own. Now, did he have any success from this? Absolutely. Nolan Bushnell created Atari in 1972 for $500, and 4 years later, in 1976, he sold it to Warner Communications for $28 million. Again, Atari was the first, but the biggest opening impact was made by Nintendo. According to Nintendo's own website, the company was founded in 1889 as a playing card manufacturer. Now, they didn't achieve their biggest success, of course, until they became a video game manufacturer. They did this in 1983. What they did was they launched the first home video game system in Japan. It was called the Family Computer, or Famicom for short, and it was an instant success. It was so successful that they redesigned the hardware, and in 1985 they did some aggressive marketing and licensing, and they launched an 8-bit Nintendo Entertainment System, or also known as the NES. They released along with it the game Super Mario Bros., and for a long time that was the pack-in game with the system. It would come with the system, the game, and a controller or two. And this game, Super Mario Bros., became a worldwide smash hit, and it became the biggest selling game of all time, which was a record that it held on to for 25 years. Now, what's industry without little competition? Next up, Sega decided to step into the game. In 1986, Sega released the Sega Master System. Now, the sales paled in comparison to the NES, but it didn't stop them. They would not stop with just one attempt and fail. They decided in 1989 to try to stay ahead of Nintendo, and they released a 16-bit Sega Genesis system. Now, 16 bits, of course, is twice as many as 8, and this means it had twice the processing power. So although it was a stronger system, it didn't do quite as well. With it, they did a $100 million advertising campaign. On a personal note, I remember this advertising campaign. Part of it was the slogan that they used in the commercial was Nintendo, which was trying to say that we have a stronger computer and we can do what Nintendo can't do. And I remember watching that campaign on television and wanting the system. Then I got one, and it turned out it wasn't quite as good as what the Nintendo was about to come out with, which was the next year they released the Super Nintendo. It was a slower processor than the Genesis system that Sega had put out, but it still outsold it. Partially this could have been because of the name recognition with the system. People had bought the Nintendo, they liked it, so when they came out with a successor to it, they decided to stick with it. Next up was the Sony PlayStation. That was the next system to come out. This was released in 1994 in Japan, and it sold 100,000 units on the first day of sale. Now, again, a side note about this, the Sony PlayStation was originally supposed to be a CD add-on drive for the Super Nintendo, but it didn't work out quite that way. The day after Nintendo officially announced that they were working with Sony in order to produce this unit, they went and they broke their deal with Sony because they couldn't in the negotiations, they couldn't come to an agreement between Sony and Nintendo on who would get the most profits from it. So Nintendo broke the deal with Sony, and they started one with Philips instead. Now, what happened here is Philips, that didn't go through either. The system never came out. Philips instead made the system on their own. They called it the CDI. It sold horribly. The games were quite bad, and the only plus was they got to make games out of the same hardware, some of the same characters that Nintendo had created for their own system. But again, they didn't sell very well. The CDI kind of just slipped off into the background. Now, what could have happened, actually, this worked out really well, because since the partnership between Nintendo and Sony broke down, Sony went and made their own system, the PlayStation, and it did quite well. Again, now in 1995, Sega decides to come back, and they want to get back in the game again, so they released the Sega Saturn. Not a big seller, and with Sony in the game now, their sales were even worse. They dropped down to third place, where they had been in second previously. The same year, PlayStation arrives in the US and sells over 2 million units. In 1996, Nintendo launched the Nintendo 64. Did pretty good in sales, enough to be second instead of third, which still was owned by Sega and their attempts. In 1999, Sega tried to jump back into it, and they released the Sega Dreamcast. Although this was technologically a groundbreaking system, it could do things that none of the others could, it didn't have the sales. It didn't sell well at all, and after years of second place and then third place, Sega just decided to get out of the game, and they switched to making software and bowed out, and no more hardware for them. In 2000, Sony released the PlayStation 2. In 2001, Nintendo releases the GameCube. 2001, a new competitor comes into the game again. This time it's Microsoft, entering with the Xbox. This was the first console to include a hard drive on the system, much like a computer has. Now, with Microsoft in league, with Sony and Nintendo competing with each other, gaming is now a mainstream status. Over the next 10 years, all three of these companies would continue releasing new systems on about a 5-year basis, and they would all have great success. Now that you know the history behind the systems and where they came from, allow me to present some information about the industry as a whole. According to data released by the NPD Group, which is a global marketing and research company, the video game industry posted some of its strongest sales in 2011, nearly $25 billion. To give you an idea of what that means, the movie industry posted only $10 billion in ticket sales in the same year. Not to say that that's bad, but to a frame of reference to show you how big gaming has become. Some other interesting statistics about gaming are as follows. The average game player is 30 years old, but the average game purchaser is 35, and 68% of all gamers are 18 years of age or older. The average household owns at least one system, whether it's a console, a PC, or a smartphone. They consider a smartphone a system in this particular statistic because it does have gaming related to it. When it comes to gender, 47% of gamers are women, and women over 18 are the fastest growing demographic. Again, this is a slightly skewed statistic because they are considering anyone who owns a smartphone as a gamer, and that means if you play a game such as Peggle on your phone, or even Words with Friends, you're considered a gamer by their standards. Finally, surprisingly, more adult women are playing video games than boys under 18 years old. Final two stats. The most successful franchise of all time, with 262 million games sold, is the Super Mario series, the same series that launched with the NES way back in 1985. The most successful console of all time, with the total number of units sold, is the PlayStation 2, with 153.6 million systems worldwide. What that says, Nintendo breaking away from Sony was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to Sony. Having said all that, what I hope you take away from all this is a greater knowledge of video games and video game industry and the history behind all of it. From the early beginnings to where they are now, it's grown in exponential ways. It started as a little white blip on a screen bouncing back and forth, and it's grown into visuals that rival photographs and live-action movies. And also, it started as a $500 company, it became an industry that generates billions of dollars a year, even more than the movie industry. And most importantly, when you think of a gamer, instead of a guy in his parents' basement eating Cheetos and drinking Mountain Dew, gamers encompass people from both genders and all walks of life, including celebrities, politicians, all sorts of productive members of society. In fact, of all the people watching this, if you're not a gamer yourself, I can almost guarantee that you know one. Thank you for watching, and take care.